Most people never think about what happens behind the cold, steel doors of a morgue. They don't wonder what it's like for the people who work there, the ones who are surrounded by death every day. But what if I told you that the real horror doesn't come from the bodies, but from the things that shouldn't be moving, speaking, or even breathing? Tonight, you're about to hear the stories that no one talks about, the ones that happen when the doors of the morgue close, when the lights flicker out, and when the refrigerators are filled with more than just the dead. These aren't stories of ghosts or spirits, but something far worse, something that crosses a line between the living and the dead. Meet Carl, a morgue attendant who thought he had seen it all. But one night, as he worked alone in the refrigerated room, something happened that would change his life forever. It started with a noise, a soft tapping coming from one of the body drawers. He laughed it off at first. A rat, maybe? But then it started to happen every night. At first, Carl thought it was his imagination, but soon he couldn't deny the truth. Something in that morgue wasn't quite right. Something that should have been lifeless was moving, watching him. And when Carl opened one of those drawers one night, he found more than just a body. He found something that no human should ever have to see. But the real question is, what do you think is really going on in the morgue at night? The truth is stranger than you could possibly imagine, and it's a truth that's been buried until now. Carl stood frozen in front of the body drawer, his hand still gripping the cold steel handle. The tapping sound had stopped, but the air around him felt thicker, heavier. His breath was shallow, each inhale feeling like a struggle against the oppressive silence of the morgue. He knew the sound he had heard wasn't normal. It wasn't a rat or a faulty refrigeration unit. It was something alive, something in the drawer with him. He slowly pulled the drawer open, every nerve in his body screaming for him to stop. But he couldn't move. There was a body inside, just as there should be, pale, lifeless. The skin of the deceased was an eerie shade of blue. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the faint, barely perceptible movement of the chest. Carl blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The chest rose and fell. His heart skipped a beat, panic flooding his veins. Was the body breathing? Impossible. There was no way. No one could survive being in the fridge for days, let alone move like that. He stepped back, his mind racing, trying to rationalize the impossible. He thought it could be some kind of bizarre after-death reflex, but the longer he stared, the more it seemed like the body wasn't just moving. It was watching him. The eyes, still closed, felt too aware, too alive. Carl slammed the drawer shut, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He took several deep breaths, trying to steady himself. This had to be a trick of the mind. Maybe the isolation was getting to him, making him imagine things. But when he turned to leave, he heard it again, the tapping, louder this time, faster. He turned back to the drawer, but this time it was different. The body wasn't where it had been before. The drawer was slightly open again. Before he could move, the lights flickered above him, casting long shadows across the morgue. The temperature dropped suddenly, and Carl could see his breath forming in the cold air. He felt the unmistakable presence of something moving in the shadows, something that shouldn't have been there. His skin crawled. He had to leave. But as he turned to make his escape, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the room. Slow, deliberate steps, coming from behind him. Carl didn't look back. He ran, stumbling over his own feet, his heart racing. He reached the door to the break room, but as he pushed it open, it slammed shut violently, trapping him inside. He was trapped. The door wouldn't budge. The room felt like it was closing in on him, suffocating him. Panic set in, and Carl pounded on the door with all his strength, shouting for help, but there was no answer. There never was. The footsteps were getting closer now. Too close. Carl turned around, only to find the refrigerator drawers opening on their own. The bodies were moving, shifting. One by one, the drawers slid open, revealing their contents. And then he saw it, a figure emerging from one of the open drawers. It was not a body at all. It was a man, covered in the same blue, lifeless skin, his eyes open wide, staring directly at Carl. But the man didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply pointed toward Carl. Frozen in place, Carl could barely breathe. The figure's finger pointed directly at him, and he knew in that instant, whatever was happening in this morgue, it wasn't just supernatural. It was a warning, a message. Carl ran again, but the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging him into darkness. He heard the shuffle of feet, but this time it wasn't the bodies. It was something else, something worse. The last thing Carl saw before the darkness swallowed him was the figure standing in the center of the room. His mouth open, but no sound came out. And then the tapping resumed. The darkness seemed to pulse around Carl, pressing against him from every side. He stumbled blindly, his hands groping for any solid surface. He was certain that someone was following him just out of sight. The cold was unbearable. But it wasn't just the temperature. It was the unnatural chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. It wasn't just a morgue anymore. It was something far worse. His heart hammered in his chest as he scrambled towards the exit. But just as his hand reached for the door handle, a sound froze him in his tracks. A soft, raspy whisper coming from behind him. Carl. His body went cold. He didn't dare turn around. The voice wasn't from any living person. He could hear it, feel it, all around him. It was like it came from the walls themselves, from the very ground beneath his feet. Carl, it's too late. You shouldn't have looked. The voice was haunting, dripping with an ancient malice that seemed to drag the air out of the room. Carl could feel his sanity slipping away, piece by piece. He turned, finally, unable to resist the pull of the voice. And what he saw made his blood freeze. The man, the figure, was standing in front of him now, its face just inches away, its eyes wide open but unseeing, locked in an eternal stare that seemed to pierce through Carl's soul. The man's lips moved again, though no sound came. Then the figure opened his mouth in an impossible, grotesque way, as though it stretched beyond human limits. Carl's stomach lurched. Suddenly, the refrigerator doors opened with a violent crash, revealing several more bodies, each one slightly different. Some were frozen stiff, while others were unnervingly limber, their arms stretching out toward him as though reaching for something or someone. Carl backed away, his feet stumbling over his own legs. The figure continued to inch closer, its breath cold against his skin. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. You were curious. Now you'll stay with us forever. Carl's mind raced. What had he stumbled upon? What was this place, this morgue, really hiding? It wasn't just a place where the dead were kept. It was a place where the dead waited. For what exactly? And why had the bodies in the refrigerators come to life? The figure in front of Carl suddenly jerked its head toward the open refrigerator drawers. Its eyes widened in a way that should have been impossible, its mouth curling into a grin that stretched too far. Carl could feel his pulse in his throat, the pounding rhythm of fear. Then, the figure slowly reached into its own chest, as if it were peeling itself apart, revealing what was underneath, a mass of writhing, blackened tendrils, moving with a sickening slowness. It pulled something from within, something small but alive, a tiny, distorted hand. The room felt as though it was suffocating him, as if the air was thickening around him. His vision blurred, and the whispers seemed to echo in his head, like 1,000 voices screaming at once. "Carl, come closer, we need you." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a chorus, each voice twisted and contorted in agony. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. But somehow, his body forced him to take a step forward. His legs betrayed him, moving toward the figure, toward the writhing mass. Just as his hand reached out to touch the figure, the lights flickered back on briefly, and Carl saw it. The truth. The walls of the morgue had disappeared, replaced by a void, endless, black, and cold. The bodies weren't just waking up. They were calling out, pulling him in, and as the figure's grip tightened around his wrist, Carl realized that this morgue wasn't just a place of death. It was a prison for the dead, a place where they waited for new souls to come and join them in their endless torment. And then, just as quickly as it began, everything went black. The last thing Carl heard was the tapping again. But this time, it was coming from within him. Carl's body felt heavy, as though it were being pulled down into the earth itself. The darkness that had swallowed him was suffocating, and for a moment he thought he had passed out, drowned in the blackness. But then the weight on his chest lifted, and a cold, ragged breath filled his lungs. He gasped, his eyes snapping open, expecting to see the same void he had been swallowed by. But instead, he was lying on the cold, steel floor of the morgue. The same refrigerated drawers. His body screamed in pain, but his mind was worse. The whispers were gone. At least, they seemed to be, until Carl realized they weren't whispers at all. They were voices, low, guttural, filling his mind with thoughts that weren't his own. "You belong here now, Carl." The voice was so clear, so real. His head snapped to the side, eyes wide with terror. But the morgue was empty. No figures. No bodies moving in the drawers. The cold was overwhelming, but still, something was wrong. He forced himself to sit up, but his body refused to obey him, as though it were no longer his. He looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling as he placed them on the cold floor to push himself up. They didn't look right. The skin was pale, almost translucent, as if it had been drained of life. "No, no, no!" Carl's mind screamed. He tried to move again, but the pain in his body was intense, a deep, crushing agony as though his muscles had been pulled apart and stitched back together wrong. The morgue around him seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the air thick with dread. Carl's breathing grew ragged as he looked toward the rows of body drawers. He saw them now more than just bodies. The drawers were empty, yes, but they were not clean. The metal was worn, rusted with years of neglect. And the names etched into the drawers, names he didn't recognize, names that seemed to have been erased and rewritten, were no longer legible. They were changing. Carl's vision blurred again, and when it cleared, the names were different. The bodies inside were different. He tried to call out, but no sound left his throat. His lips parted, but only the silent, suffocating breath of the morgue escaped. Something was moving again, not from within the drawers, but from within Carl. The tiny hand that the figure had pulled from its chest, the hand that had reached for him, now moved inside of him, pushing through his ribs, clawing its way out from within, as though it were trying to live. Carl screamed. At least, he thought he screamed. The sensation of it tore at him, twisting his insides the way something alien, something ancient, sought to break free from him. His skin began to tear as the thing inside of him worked its way out, its jagged, twisted form pressing against his flesh, forcing him to the ground. And then the doors to the morgue slammed open. Carl's head snapped toward the noise, but his body refused to turn, his limbs locked in place by something that wasn't his own will. He could feel his eyes, his gaze, his consciousness slowly slipping into whatever had taken root inside him. A figure entered the room, and it wasn't human. It wasn't even something that could be called figure. It was an essence, something far beyond form, something that flickered and twisted between the realms of the living and the dead, a creature, a force, calling Carl toward it. It was the one thing Carl had feared from the very beginning, the thing that had always waited in the shadows, watching him, waiting for him to cross the threshold into something far worse than death. The creature moved closer, its shadow creeping across the room, and Carl felt himself being pulled in, drawn toward it. He could feel it, the presence, closing in on him, pushing him toward the abyss. "It's your turn now," the voice said again, but this time it was not in his head. It was in the room. It was the creature speaking to him, its voice deep, hollow, and filled with the promises of endless darkness. Carl wanted to fight, to escape, but his body was no longer his. It was a vessel for something darker, something far more ancient, and with one final surge of force, Carl was dragged into the creature's grasp, his vision going black once more. The tapping resumed, and this time it wasn't Carl. It was something else, something that had taken root in the morgue, something that would never leave. Carl's vision was fading. The room, the morgue, everything was becoming a blur, a distant echo that no longer mattered. The cold metal beneath him, the rusted drawers, the flickering lights, it was all slipping away. But the voice, that voice, continued to echo inside his mind, twisting and warping with every passing second. "You're not alone." The last thing Carl saw before everything went black was a figure. No, the essence, standing over him, its eyes glowing with malevolent, unnatural light. And then nothing. When Carl woke again, it wasn't the sterile, suffocating cold of the morgue. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark, vast, and cold. He could feel the pressure of the air around him, the heavy, thick darkness pressing in from all sides. It felt familiar, but wrong. And the tapping, he could hear it again, louder now. Carl tried to move, but his body felt strange, alien. His hands twitched, but they were not his own. His legs, his arms, everything was wrong. His thoughts were distant, fractured, as though someone else had taken residence in his mind. He wasn't in control anymore. And then it hit him. He wasn't alone. A voice, his own voice, spoke to him from the depths of his mind. "You should have never looked. Now you'll stay here, just like all the others." Carl wanted to scream, but no sound came. He wanted to fight, to break free, but his body wouldn't obey. His eyes locked onto the dark, formless shape standing just beyond his reach. The figure was there, watching, waiting, and then, in the silence, Carl realized something. The tapping, it wasn't just the bodies. It was the living. It was Carl, too. But the real question remained, who was still alive? In that moment, Carl knew something deeper, darker had taken place in that morgue. The souls of the dead weren't just trapped. They were waiting for the next body to claim, the next soul to take. And as Carl's vision dimmed once more, he understood the horrifying truth. The morgue had never been just a place of death. It was a recruitment ground, a place where the living and the dead merged, where souls were recruited to become part of the prison. And now, Carl wasn't just a victim. He was a recruiter, but it wasn't just his fate. It was everyone's. If you disturb the dead will disturb you. And Carl, he wasn't the first. And he certainly wouldn't be the last. As Carl's fate turns into something even darker and more sinister than simply being a victim, the story ends on a chilling note, suggesting that the morgue isn't just a place of death. It's a place where the dead recruit new souls. This opens the door for endless speculation and a powerful invitation for viewers to comment, share their theories, and discuss the dark twist that Carl has now become part of this horrifying cycle.